Hello, and welcome to Women in Music. My name is Julia Catherine Walsh, and along with my wonderful collaborator and pianist, Dr. Tsu-Hwa Ho, we would like to bring you into the world of women in music in 3 different categories. And today's recital centers on women as muses. Next recital, we will be talking about women as performers, and the recital after that, we will discuss women as composers. However, today's recital, we are going to focus on women serving in the role of muse to composers who were men. So, I hope that you're as excited as I am to talk about this topic, and thus I'd like to thank you so much for being here and joining us, and let's get to it! The first pieces that you will hear in today's performance are from what could be termed music history's most famous couple. That's right, the composer was Robert Schumann, and his inspiration or his muse was Clara Schumann, his wife. These particular songs we'll hear today are from his Opus 39, otherwise known as Liederkreis, and they are set to poems by Joseph von Eichendorff from his poem set called Intermezzo. There are 12 songs in the set, but today we will hear the first 5, which I think are the most interesting and the most beautiful. And these particular songs were written in 1840 between May and August, which is known as Schumann's Liederjahr, or Year of Song, because in that particular year he composed 140 songs, which is incredible if you think about it, and especially considering that was basically half of his song output eventually. So within 1 year he was so incredibly productive. Why might that be, you ask? Well, he had a really important motivator. He wanted to marry Clara Wieck. And he had known Clara since she was 8 years old, because it was at that time that he came to study with her father, Friedrich, in Leipzig, who was one of the most renowned piano teachers of the day. Thus, he moved in with the Wiecks, and he met and got to know Clara right when she began touring throughout Europe as a piano virtuoso. For Schumann, who was just beginning to learn about the basics of piano technique and was quite undeveloped in his pianistic skill, to see Clara already so much beyond him and so refined and so poised and so musical just blew him away. And thus they began slowly to fall in love with one another over a relatively long period of time, actually 10 years. And it was in the last 3 of those 10 years that they began seriously to talk about marriage and to endeavor to marry one another, although Clara was still under the legal age where she could choose whom she would like to marry without parental consent. Thus, they came into the problem of having to go to court, actually, to circumvent her father, who didn't want the match whatsoever, and his wishes. Now, it's kind of strange to think that a man who knew his own student and his student's abilities might not want this student to marry his daughter. But then again, you say, oh, okay, maybe that's why, because he knew that Schumann perhaps wasn't so motivated as a piano student and wasn't always practicing and, maybe didn't have a lot of follow-through in that way. And he was worried that Schumann might not be able to provide a stable home for his daughter, especially since he decided to pursue a career as a composer, which Friedrich knew was very uncertain, very unstable, and not, let's say, as comfortable and as easy a life as Clara would have had if she was married to a lawyer, which is what Schumann first began studying and then never finished. So, Friedrich didn't want them to marry, but Clara and Robert were very insistent upon marrying, and they decided to find their own way to do it. So while Clara went on concertizing, and her father showed up everywhere she went with distributing little papers with all sorts of gossip and bad things about Robert and Clara in order to discourage them, Robert decided that because the court said you needed to have a certain amount of money and prove that you were able to provide for your intended once you were married, he would decide how he should go about earning money. And then he came upon the idea of writing songs. He had tried to sell his solo piano pieces, and he had even gotten Chopin to play them in concert all over Germany, but to no avail. They didn't sell hardly as fast as he would need them to. He wasn't sure if they were too virtuosic or if they were too complex or what the scenario might have been that people didn't purchase them, but they sat on the shelves. So he thought, all right, I'll try art song. And interestingly enough, his art song was a total hit. Of course, it still is nowadays, which shows his merits as a composer. But at the time, he was quite surprised. And so he began throwing himself into art song and thus composing 140 in 1 year. These particular pieces, though, were written for Clara as a wedding present. And Schumann said, I'll quote him here, in a letter that he wrote to Clara, he said, "They are my most romantic music ever, with much of you in it, dearest Clara." So we know that they were incredibly in love and that he just was trying to do the best he could in order to win the lawsuit and finally marry the person with whom he felt such an incredible kinship, musically and personally. So they actually ended up winning the lawsuit, and they got married 1 day before Clara turned 21, which is when she would have been able to marry without her father's consent. This perhaps illustrates that Clara and Robert were willing to overcome any hurdles to ensure that their love could endure and that they could be together. And overcome some hurdles they would, not only in their trying to get married, but also in their married life. It of course wasn't any easier to be a concertizing pianist wife and a composer husband who ended up having 8 children together. So talk about a busy household, but also they only had 1 piano at home, and thus Clara could only practice when Robert wasn't using it to compose. And he insisted that he have complete silence whenever he was composing. So in turn, Clara had to do a lot of practicing in her head. Talk about a patient and virtuosic woman. It's pretty impressive. However, beyond that, they moved a lot. They were living originally in Leipzig, then they went to Dresden, then they moved to Düsseldorf as engagements called them, as teaching was available to them. So it wasn't always a steady family life in one place. And Robert, unbeknownst to Clara, had been kind of fighting the slow dissolution of his mind due to what historians and scholars now suppose was the final stages of syphilis. And he, when they were living in Düsseldorf, tried to commit suicide by jumping into the Rhine River, and luckily a fisherman found him and saved him, although he didn't want to be saved. And so it was at that point that he and his psychologist realized that he needed to be committed to a sanatorium, which was common practice at the time, and thus he was put away for 2 years, and Clara wasn't allowed to see him, not once, until unfortunately 2 days before he passed away. So although they had incredible love for one another, it couldn't withstand everything that life could throw at them. However, Clara was so convinced of Robert's incredible genius in composition and the importance of the works that he created that once he passed away, she decided to hang up her composer hat and focus solely on publishing, proofreading, editing, and doing whatever was necessary, performing the premieres everywhere she went of Robert's pieces. And so she was his biggest and most influential champion during her lifetime, and because of that, and because of her wide reach in performing everywhere, and all of her musical contemporaries that she knew, who she spread the word to about Robert's pieces, we have cemented Robert Schumann in musical history now, solely through Clara's efforts, I would like to believe. And then, of course, it caught on as people realized how wonderful his music was. But it took Clara's belief in him to really get him there. So muses are not just important as muses, but also as people who actually do the work to bring the music to its important and rightful place in the canon. Okay, I hope you're excited to hear these 5 Schumann songs.
Vater und redest doch keine, wie mir so wohl ist, so wohl. Ach, wüsstest nur eine, kein Mensch es sonst wissen soll. So still ist's nicht draußen im Schnee, so stumm und verschwiegen sind die Sterne nicht in der Höhe, als meine Gedanken sind. Ich wünsch, ich wär ein Vöglein und zöge über das Meer, voll über das Meer und weiter bis, dass ich im Himmel wär. Weiß, und redest doch keine, wie mir so wohl ist, so wohl. Ach, wüsstest nur eine, kein Mensch es sonst wissen soll. Kein Mensch es sonst wissen soll.
These next songs you'll be hearing are from composer Andre Previn and his muse Renee Fleming. They're his 3 Dickinson songs to poems by Emily Dickinson, which were composed in 1999 and premiered that same year with Renee Fleming and Richard Botto on piano in Quebec, and then recorded in 2001 with Renee Fleming as the soloist and Andre Previn himself playing piano for Deutsche Grammophon. A little bit about Andre Previn. He was born in Berlin, Germany, but his family was Jewish, and so they moved to Los Angeles to escape from the Nazis. Shortly thereafter, due to his musical talent, he began ingratiating himself in the music scene of Hollywood, which meant composing, conducting the orchestra for film scores, and of course learning all he could about jazz, which at the time was a big influence in Hollywood and just popular culture in the States. He started to love jazz, and so much so that he began a concertizing career as a jazz pianist and worked with some of the most notable names in jazz, like Ella Fitzgerald and Dizzy Gillespie. However, over the years, as he grew, he was interested in more than just jazz and piano playing and composing, and so he began to make a name for himself as a conductor, and thus he received an incredible amount of orchestral positions as principal conductors with really important symphonies all across the world. One of his most famous collaborations was with the London Symphony Orchestra, and he has a ton of CDs and recordings from that time together. I would encourage you to go listen to them because people are still speaking about what a wonderful conductor Previn was and how that made the music really come to life. But you might wonder how he and Renee crossed paths, since you might know her as an opera singer. However, Renee wasn't always solely dedicated to classical singing, and she still isn't if you're a really big fan and you know a little bit more about her. But she loved jazz as well growing up and sang quite a lot of it in her undergraduate and her graduate studies, and she used it actually to earn money as kind of a side gig. However, as she rose to stardom in the classical world and as an opera singer, she never forgot her jazz roots, and she actually put out an album later on that was jazz-inspired and that were songs written for her in a jazz idiom. Thus, it was when Previn turned 70 and began composing his very first opera that he thought of Renee as the title character, since he was composing A Streetcar Named Desire, which would have a lot of jazz influence, but was still an opera. Therefore, that was the first time that they worked together, and they instantly became really good friends and respected one another as colleagues and as jazz lovers. So it was that from this friendship grew out a lot of commissioning and performing and premiering pieces that Previn wrote for Renee, which you'll see in the slide. In the same year that this piece was written, which we'll be hearing today, he wrote an orchestral piece for her. Then later on, he wrote another song cycle in 2017 still, and even up until his death, he was working on a piece called Penelope, which he didn't fully finish, but which was intended for Renee and which she has since premiered to great acclaim. Interestingly, Renee felt as strongly toward Previn and admired him as much as he her, and I'd like to share a quote that I have found online from her website about Andre Previn. He writes beautifully for the voice, period. He has a lyrical sort of voice, compositionally. The prosody is wonderful. You can understand people. He's also willing to say, the orchestra is too loud there. Cut it. I never saw anybody do that so easily. He has no problem with that. I assume that's from all his years of arranging, orchestrating, and everything else he has done. He's just very experienced. The other thing is, he is so facile. I was gathering some material for Julie Harris for this Emily Dickinson theatrical production I did a long time ago with Charles Nelson Riley. I was reaching out to composers and asking, do you have any Emily Dickinson settings? Because most people did. Andre said, no, but I will tomorrow. That's what he did. He was remarkable in that way. I loved collaborating with him. It was simply a joy. If I needed something, he immediately understood. He was very open-minded, and I really liked his musical language. He was just a wonderful person, so lovely to spend time with. You know, even in this last year, which was 2019, he was calling me and saying, let's do a jazz album. He could do anything. I think that pretty much sums up that sometimes it can go both ways with muse and composer as well. So I hope you're now curious to hear 3 Dickinson songs.
As imperceptibly as grief, the summer lapsed away, too imperceptible at last, to seem like perfidy. Quietness stay still, as twilight long begun, on nature spending with herself, sequestered after dusk to earlier in, the morning foreign shone, a courteous yet harrowing grace, as guest that would be gone, and thus without a wing, or service of a keel, our summer made her light escape into the Will there really be a morning? Is there such a thing as day? Could I see it from the mountains if I were as tall as they? As it feels like water lilies, as it feathers like a bird, is it brought from famous countries of which I have never Oh, some scholar, oh, some sailor, oh, some wise man from the skies, please to tell a little pilgrim where the place good morning lies. Good morning, midnight, I'm
The next four pieces you'll be hearing are by another very famous musical history couple. You think you know who it is? Ah, that's right. Richard Strauss was the composer, and his muse was his wife, Pauline de Ahna. These pieces that we'll be hearing are his Mädchenblumen, or Girl Flowers, from his opus number 22. These were taken from poems by Felix Dahn and likely published in a magazine that was widely syndicated and most widely read in all of Germany, called Gartenlaube, which is probably where Strauss came upon them and learned of them. They were dedicated to, in a friendly manner, Strauss wrote, a tenor named Hans Giessen, who also premiered them. But they were written in 1888, so we know that the inspiration for these pieces was actually Pauline. So let's get into a little bit of the history between Richard and Pauline. In 1887, the year before these pieces were written, she met him and became his private student while he was assistant conductor at the State Opera in Munich. Then they liked one another so much, even though it was reported that they often butted heads in terms of opinion and in rehearsals, that in 1889, when Richard was given the post of principal conductor at the opera in Weimar, he invited Pauline to come along with him, and he, of course, was responsible for casting and gave her all the leading lady roles in every show that they did, which was quite a number and earned her huge popularity. Then, in 1894, there was a turning point in their relationship when, in the rehearsal of his very first opera, Guntram, which, of course, the first opera that Strauss wrote had to be completely bombastic because his composing later on was just incredible and nearly the cusp of what could be done in the musical composing world of that time without going into total 20th century techniques. So his first foray into opera was a little bit, maybe he was a little bit testing the waters and didn't quite choose everything perfectly. Thus, for the tenor, it was totally difficult, and he was making mistakes left and right in the orchestra rehearsal and had to be constantly stopped. But when it came to Pauline, who had learned her music really well and did everything perfectly, she wasn't stopped once. And Richard, of course, was conducting. And after she was finished her aria, she said to him, "Why didn't you stop me?" And then he said, "You sang perfectly. Why did I need to stop for?" And then she just got so mad. She had her score in hand and she said, "I wanted to be stopped." And then she threw it right at his head. Good thing that it didn't hit him. But anyway, it had made an impression nonetheless. And we hear historically from orchestra members that what happened next was she stormed off to her dressing room. He followed her. There was incredible yelling and fighting that could be heard through the door. And then Richard emerged and somebody said, "Oh my gosh, what are you going to do to her? She threw a score at your head." And then he said, "I'm going to marry her." And it was that they got publicly engaged. Funnily enough, it's now found out that they had been secretly engaged a few months prior to that rehearsal. So maybe it was that Pauline felt that he was taking a little too much time proposing to her, and that's just the straw that broke the camel's back in that rehearsal. Who knows? But we can guess. Anyway, from that point on, they were actually quite happy together, and when Richard got offered the post of principal conductor at the Munich State Opera, they went back to Munich together, and he gave Pauline all of the leading lady roles until 1897, when she gave birth to their first and only child, Franz. But the birth, unfortunately, had complications that would prevent Pauline from undertaking an opera career of the size that she had had before the birth, and thus she quit opera and just sung her husband's songs with him in concert every so often. But she didn't do a lot of traveling or anything like that. So if he wanted to premiere his pieces other places, he would have to get other people to do it, like, for example, Hans Giessen. However, Strauss was quoted as saying, "I thank my almighty creator for the gift and inspiration of the female voice." So we know that Pauline's voice and her temperament and just her character were the total inspiration for everything that he wrote, especially for soprano, of which the majority of his repertoire is, especially his songs. So thank you, Pauline. We have a lot to be grateful for as sopranos. And they had a really loving and wonderful marriage. And she was a wonderful wife and caring, and she took care of their little boy wonderfully, and she worried about Strauss's health when he wasn't getting enough walks. And so when they were at home together, they would take daily walks in nature and in the Alps and go hiking, because they lived in Garmisch, which was right on the edge of the mountains. And when he was away from her and had to travel, he wrote her a love letter every day. And it was said by their good friend Manfred Markhoff that Strauss would never have become a great man without Pauline. So again, another partnership that was instrumental to the benefit of both, and for which we can be incredibly grateful nowadays. I hope you enjoy these Mädchenblumen.
sich im Heide, gehütet vom Schwan, deren Kreis sind sie einsam. Sie erschließt sich nur dem Wandenschein, mit dem ihr der silberne Schimmer gemeinsam. So blüht sie, die zauberische Schwester der Sterne, umschwärmt von der träumerisch dunklen Verlene, die am Runde des Teichs sich sehne von Ferne, und sie nimmer erreicht, wie sie sich sehne. Wasserrose, so nenn ich die schranke Nachtloch gemeint, Alabastern von Wohnen, in dem Auge der weinenden tiefe Gedanken, als sei sie ein Geist und auf Erden gefahren. Wenn sie spricht, ist wie silbernes Wogenrauschen. Wenn sie schweigt, ist die ahnende Stille der Mondnacht. Sie scheint mit dem Sternenblicke zu tauschen, deren Sprache die gleiche Natur sie gewohnt macht. Du kannst nie ermüden, ins Auge zu schauen, dass die Seide im Baum säumt hat, und du glaubst, wie bezaubert vom seligem Grauen, was jede Romantik von Elfen geträumt hat.
Well, we've arrived at the last set of songs for today's performance, and they are Samuel Barber's Hermit Songs. They're based on 10 poems found in sacred Irish texts, scribbled in manuscripts that were actually hand-copied at the time. They probably weren't meant to be seen by anybody, but scholars found them, and they have been translated since by notable authors such as W.H. Auden into the English that you will hear today. These pieces were able to be composed by Barber because of a generous commission from the Elizabeth Sprague Coolidge Foundation, who was his muse. They were written in 1952 to 1953 and performed on October 30th in 1953, which was only unfortunately 5 days before Elizabeth Sprague Coolidge's death. They were performed with Barber at the piano and Leontine Price singing the songs, and this was actually 4 years before Ms. Price would sing in Poulenc's Dialogues of the Carmelites in San Francisco, which would mark her operatic debut. So she wasn't all that well known in this country yet, which also makes it really interesting to hear the recordings of the premiere. You can find them online. Let's talk a little bit more about Elizabeth Sprague Coolidge and how this incredibly influential woman not only helped Barber to compose these songs, but also helped numerous other important composers to make pieces of musical history. Elizabeth Sprague Coolidge was an only child who grew up in Chicago in an affluent family and was given an early education in piano playing. Her mother was also an excellent musician, and this fueled her desire to become a professional pianist. But of course, society held her back because for a woman of her stature that was completely impossible. And so she contented herself with becoming an amateur recitalist, a composer, a lecturer, and a chamber musician. Then at 27, she fulfilled her societal obligation of marrying, and she married one Frederick Shurtleff, who was a Harvard-born surgeon and was from a notable Boston family. Unfortunately, during one of the surgeries he was performing, relatively soon after their marriage, he contracted syphilis and then ended up having to suffer the debilitating consequences of that disease over many years. They had one child together, Albert, But because Frederick was going from place to place to find miracle cures or to get opinions from different doctors of his condition, oftentimes Elizabeth and Albert were left home alone at their house in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. However, Albert learned to play the violin, and this provided them with an opportunity to have some chamber music moments together. Elizabeth also credited her piano playing and the dedication and repetitiveness of practicing with keeping her from really deep depressions as her husband's health continued to deteriorate. However, when she turned 51 years old, her parents, whom she both loved dearly, ended up passing away close to one another. Her father first and then her mother. After her father passed away, she inherited $200,000, half of which she used to create a pension fund for the musicians of the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, the first of its kind. And her mother approved of that. And then her mother passed away, and then the very next year, her husband passed away. So all of a sudden, Elizabeth was in charge of $4 million, which may not sound like a lot in today's money, but back then was like 40 million or 400 million. It was a lot. Needless to say, she was a woman still, and that gave her not as much freedom as she would have had with that money if she were, say, Andrew Carnegie or John Rockefeller or somebody like that, who had similar amounts of money but who were men and enjoyed the freedoms that came along with that. So she kind of bided her time. She donated here and there to medical charities, hospitals, medical institutions on behalf of her husband so that maybe research could be done to prevent terrible diseases like he had to endure. But it was when she received a letter from a one Hugo Korczak, who was a violinist from the Chicago Symphony who had quit in the favor of starting his own string quartet, asking her for funding to start this string quartet because his other three members of the quartet didn't want to quit their jobs without any security of knowing that the quartet could make money. So he asked her for her aid, and she said, you know, this is exactly the kind of project that I can get on board with and that I was looking for. And so she asked them if they would call themselves the Berkshire Quartet, because she lived in the Berkshires at the time and she wanted to establish that area as a little bit of an artistic hub. And then they said, sure, no problem. So immediately she funded their lodgings and their move from Chicago to New York, because New York was more where a lot of the classical music was happening at the time. And then she chose their repertoire, she booked them gigs, and every so often she even was their pianist. And actually, what was really funny about that was, all those years ago she had dreamed of becoming a piano soloist, and now, look, she had a piano career as a chamber musician. So even though it was later in life, she still got to enjoy that, which is really wonderful, I thought. She also funded the Berkshire Music Festival and founded it after her quartet needed a place to play in the summers, and she wanted to establish a little bit of a musical colony in the Berkshires. She, though, through this, also had the opportunity to meet some really influential musical people, and so she started writing letters with some of the most famous musicians of the time. And these friendships only grew and grew, and over time she had more and more letters. And one of the people who attended the Berkshire Music Festivals was the chief of the music division at the Library of Congress, whose name was Carl Engel. And he found out about these letters and he said, oh my gosh, would you be willing to donate them to the Library of Congress? They're pieces of history, of American musical history. And, you know, she thought about it, and she suddenly realized that the Berkshire Music Festival wouldn't be able to go on without her in charge of it, in person, alive. And she realized the unfortunately short quality of people's lifetimes, and she thought, gosh, I have to do something a little bit more lasting. So it was then that Carl Engel's name came to her mind again, and she thought, you know what, that's it. She called him up and she said, Carl, I'm going to donate those letters like you had wanted. And he said, that's great. And then she said, but I also would like you to help me start a trust at the Library of Congress for music. which was the first of its kind and which was the first trust for music at the Library of Congress. So miraculously, they were able to initiate 2 pieces of legislature which were signed by the Congress and by President Calvin Coolidge, which allowed for the trust to be created. And that, of course, opened the flood doors for all other sorts of trusts to be created at the Library of Congress for different disciplines, and private trusts just like hers, which just was incredible for the history of our nation. So not only did this fund help to commission, premiere, and perform new pieces of music, but also support their germination. And she also funded the construction of an auditorium known now as the Coolidge Auditorium, where these pieces could be premiered. So besides Samuel Barber's Hermit Songs, which has become one of his most famous pieces of music, she also commissioned some other notable composers and pieces that you might recognize, like Aaron Copland's Appalachian Spring and Bella Bartok's String Quartet No. 5. So without Elizabeth Sprague Coolidge, we wouldn't have incredibly influential pieces of music, and Lord knows what those might have inspired. So she just was a powerhouse, a visionary, and we can be so thankful that she did what she did for music, and she did it with such selflessness. Therefore, without further ado, our final pieces for today's performance, Samuel Barber's Hermit Songs.
Pity me on my pilgrimage to Loch O King of the churches and the bells, bewailing your souls and your wounds, but not a tear can I squeeze from my eye. Not more so than I, after so much sin, pity me, O King. What shall I do with the heart that seeks only its own ease? Oh, only begotten Son, by whom all men were made, who shunned not the death by 3 wounds. Pity me on my pilgrimage to Loch and I with a heart that's softer than a stone. Sweet, sweet this word is true. Save, O tiny nursling you, infant Jesus at my breast, by my heart every night. I was not a child, but were begotten Mary the Jewess by heaven's light. Infant Jesus at my breast, what king is there but you could give everlasting good? Wherefore I give my food. Sing to him, maidens, sing your best. There is none that has such a right to your song as heaven's King, who every night is infant Jesus at I would like to have the men of heaven in my own house, with fats of good cheer laid out for them. I would like to have the three Marys, their fame is so great. I would like people from every corner of heaven. I would like them to be cheerful in their drinking. I would like to have Jesus sitting there among them. I would like a great lake of beer for the King of Kings. It has broken us, it has crushed us, it has drowned us, oh King of the starry kingdom of heaven. The wind has consumed us, swallowed us, as timber is devoured by crimson fire from heaven. It has broken us, it has crushed us, it has drowned us, oh King of the starry kingdom of heaven. I do not know with whom Aidan will sleep. But I do know that fair Aidan will not sleep Anger, white anger, how happy we are, alone together, scholar and cat. Each has his own work to do daily. For you it is hunting, for me study. Your shining eye watches the wall. My feeble eye is fixed on a book. You rejoice when you pause and trap a mouse. I rejoice when my mind fathoms a problem. Each with his own art, neither hinders the other. Thus we live ever, without tedium and envy. Anger, white anger, how happy we are, alone together, scholar and cat. Anger, white anger, how happy we are. How foolish the man who does not raise his voice and praise with joyful words, as he alone can heaven's high King. To whom the light burns with no soul but air, all day, everywhere, all day, everywhere. Nations sing, To